And there's a whole lot of people have already joined. So yeah, kia ora koutou anō. My name is Michael Upton. I'm Vice President of the ARAN's Council at the moment, having fun. Excuse me. And obviously, as per the topic, our membership indicated that you'd be really keen to hear about just the fundamentals of how do you know that your organisation is complying with the Public Records Act, and how could you measure that? So it's going to be a little bit of a whirlwind tour, but these are recorded, and the recordings are available to ARAN's members via our newsletter, which comes out quarterly. So everyone's welcome to join, but we figured that the easiest way we could get videos to our members was to do that via the newsletter. So basically, if you're not a member, then you won't get access to the recording, sorry, but if that's a real problem for you, sing out. Our focus is just on doing these live, having an opportunity to interact, and we'll see how we go. So yes, that's me. I'm someone who stumbled sideways into information management. Admittedly, in my case, that was in 2008, so it's been a wee while now. But I have been a software trainer, and I found myself as the corporate records advisor, as it was in Te Papa, our national museum, and since then, yeah, I've continued down the path of records and information management. And just want to quickly point out before we jump into the topic of the day that if you haven't heard of ARANS, we're the Archives and Records Association of New Zealand. We have all kinds of lovely membership benefits, which I'm not going to go through. I always try not to be that guy who just reads out everything that you can see on the slide. And one of the things that I think might be of interest is some people will know about RIMPA, which is the Records and Information Management Practitioners Alliance. They changed what RIMPA stands for, so I have to remind myself. And we have a reciprocal membership arrangement with RIMPA. So if you pay for an ARANS membership, you can get access to RIMPA membership benefits, and vice versa. If you are already a member of RIMPA Global, then you can have access to ARANS memberships, such as signing up for our newsletter. Okay, cool. So jumping into what we're covering off today, this is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour. There's a lot I could say. I'm going to focus on that very first point there. I'm going to focus on just trying to distill everything down to 3 points. I do want to talk about what's the purpose of the Public Records Act. So, like, why do we care about compliance? And I think that's really valuable. I found that very helpful in my work to think about, well, am I on the right track? You can talk about the letter of the law, but you can also talk about the spirit of the law. Like, what's the point? Why would we have certain obligations put on us? Like, what does that achieve for us or for New Zealand? Pretty important to cover off what public records even are. So what are we talking about when we talk about the Public Records Act? There's, in practice, a lot of sort of, I guess, sort of looseness, or just, being casual about using words like records and information. And I guess I just want to sort of cover off what's actually covered in the Act and what that means in our practice. Also thought it was really useful to point you to links and ways of thinking about how you could self-assess your organization. There's no way I can cover all the detail in 1 hour. So what can you do after this to basically have a look and have a, further think about that? And then finally, speed round might be a complete nightmare, not expecting you to actually digest the content, but just pointing you at the 21 requirements of the mandatory standards. So 21 legal requirements that a public office, and I'll talk about what that is, must comply with in order to be compliant. And the purpose of just putting all of those up in a speed round is that things might jump out at you and you might go, oh, great, there's a point that I need to understand more about, and it will give you a point of focus after the session. Okay. So what even is a public office? I guess starting with some of the language in the Act, when I put things in speech marks on the slide, it's because I'm quoting from the legislation or quoting from a source. So I'm trying to be very specific with the language there. So basically, public offices, I'm generalizing, I'm going to generalize a lot. Public offices tend to be about things we think of as central government or government departments, government agencies. They also cover off a whole lot of sort of boards, authorities, commissions, those kinds of bodies. It also covers schools. It covers used to cover DHBs. It covers, you know, those public organisations that are normally directly funded and have direct accountabilities to um, the government of the day. And it's in the Act, the Public Records Act. It's really used in opposition to this idea of a local authority. I don't mean opposition like we're having a scrap. I just mean in terms of distinguishing these two ideas. And if you're a local authority, really, you know, there's councils, right? So it's like a regional council, a district council, a city council. Those things are local authorities in the Act. And most of what you're expected to do is the same, but the language is often different in the Act. And for simplicity's sake, I thought it made sense. I'll just focus on what a public office does, okay? There are some differences in compliance, but a lot of the basics, the very fundamentals that I'm covering here are actually really, really very similar. So let's jump into those. Very coincidentally, when we were organizing this, found out that, you know, archives, someone advertised on the New Zealand Records listserv, oh, hey, we've just put up this new guidance, and it's pretty much bang on this topic. It's basically saying, hey, if you're just brand new to this, perhaps you've stumbled sideways like I did back in 2015. Oh, sorry, 2008, 15 years ago. No, not even that. Okay, my brain's not working. Anyway, if you stumbled sideways into a job and you're thinking, okay, cool, I think I've got these responsibilities now to do with how we manage information and records in my organization, and I don't really know what I'm doing. And frankly, that's a common occurrence. The first time that I was sort of sole charge doing information management for a small organization of about 30 people, there was no one else in the organization who knew more than me, and I didn't feel like I knew that much. So, you know, many of us have come from that kind of a background. So, if you need help with that, there's a link right there. There's actually something you can go and look up. It's literally getting started with information and records management, and it's attempting to distill in as simple a way as possible what's it all about. What is Public Records Act compliance when it comes to a public office in our context. So here's my crack at it. And this is just something I'm going to try and repeat and emphasize. On the left-hand side, I'm going to use language from the Act, and then I'm going to give you my little angle on that, I guess. So fundamentally, the first thing is the Act requires you to make sure you're capturing good records of information, or good records of decisions made, good records of actions that you took, including ones that are related to interacting with the public, but not exclusively that. So create stuff, record, document. And then once you've got those things that you do have, there are expectations and obligations around how you look after those things and make sure that someone can't just overwrite some stuff, randomly change it, delete it, you know, just chuck it somewhere where it gets lost. And so we talk about that in the Act, Section 17, yes, I'm sad, talks about maintaining records. And finally, there's the jargon in the Act, and it's really common usage in records and information management to talk about disposal, the idea of disposing of records. And disposal doesn't always mean destroy, but it means from my agency's perspective, like from the organization I work for, those things are leaving my legal custody and not my responsibility anymore. And practically, most of the time, that is about being able to chuck stuff out. It's about being able to destroy. So, in common language, I think all of us talk about disposal meaning destroying. That's not what the Act specifically means, but it is a point of focus. So we maintain the records, we keep the records for as long as they're needed for various reasons. We make sure they kind of get past their best before date, if you like. And then after that, we do have an obligation to demonstrate that we're actively getting rid of stuff that we don't need. And I'll talk more about that as we go. Okay, so 3 things. I'm going to keep trying to sort of emphasize that. And I think it's really valuable to step back and go, well, why? Why do any of that stuff? And what I've put on this slide is direct quotes from the Act, lots of words, not expecting you to read them. And then I'm going to give you my simplified version of each one. But it's worth, maybe I'm a sad guy, but I go and look at legislation.gov.nz and I look at the wording of the Public Records Act and I get that specificity around, well, what does it say that we're trying to achieve? So the first thing it says, and I'm not expecting you to read all the text on the screen, I'm going to give you my simplified version of this. It's basically granting powers to a position called the Chief Archivist and saying the Chief Archivist is the one who can set the rules around what we need to keep, when we could get rid of that, and minimum retention periods for how long we need to keep that stuff before we could get rid of that. And in some cases, we can never get rid of stuff because it's of intergenerational value to New Zealand. It's stuff that ought to be retained, it ought to be something that we can get access to help tell the story of New Zealand and to help understand the interaction between our government, our democratically elected officials, and the people of the day. And, more on that shortly. So the second one, that's probably a bit of a nice segue here. It's this theme of making sure the government can be held to account. If you don't have records of what the government did, you can't really ask to get access to those, can you? So that's how I think about it. And for me, this is the thing I care about the most. This is the thing I would get on a soapbox about. If we do not capture good records of the decisions being made, the use of public funds, the policy choices, the interventions that government makes that affect New Zealanders' lives, then basically we can't really have any confidence in what the government is doing, or we're operating in a democracy where basically it's just guesswork about what's if I vote someone in, then what actually happens, what actually happens next, and how can I have confidence that basically the government that's elected to represent me is representing me or doing what they say they'll do. So the public sector, as the kind of delivery arm of the government of the day, needs to keep good records. And then in that first point, we're saying, well, okay, we're granting these powers. So the Act says, look, we need someone who's going to determine when we need to keep things that actually ought to be kept forever. And what are they going to do with that? Well, they're going to put them in an archive, right? And so this is Archives New Zealand's role when it relates to kind of collection management and perhaps the more sort of heritage aligned functions of our National Archive, is that, well, okay, we're collecting up these government records that meet certain criteria. But what I'm emphasizing, I think, with that second point is that the Act is also really focused on information that would never get to an archive and is not about that heritage thing. It is about making sure there is sufficient information to feed and water other legislation such as the Official Information Act. And I'll come back to it. So on that point, basically, one of the purposes of the Act is to basically make sure that there's kind of good rules in place, or things that would enable the people of New Zealand to trust that the government's managing information well. And that leads through to the final point, which is basically saying this Act exists to establish a framework in which public sector information is managed and must be managed. So it's establishing powers for the Chief Archivist for Archives New Zealand, and it's establishing obligations for the public sector. Okay. I won't belabor the point, but I find actually looking to the purposes of the legislation is really valuable when I'm trying to think about what matters in my work and I'm trying to make a decision about something. It's like, well, why do these obligations exist? Not just what are the obligations, but what's the point? Okay. So again, I'm going to hit you with some words from the Act itself, and then I'm just going to give you my incredible simplification of it, okay? Words. So what we've got here is basically boils down to, so a record is basically just saying any recorded information. That point A, stuff on paper. Point B, stuff that's held in a physical storage medium that's not paper, such as films, negatives, tapes. So it's telling you straight away, a record could be a video, a record could be an image, a record could be audio. Yeah. And then C, in 2025, I really hope for your sake that most of what you're doing as an organization sits here is actually electronic, right? And it um, earlier in the definition, it basically makes it absolutely explicit that a record can be data, so it can be in a database, it could be in the back end of an application that you're using, or it could be in an electronic document or file, okay? But then what's the public bit? So the distinction here is really that it's something that meets those above criteria that is created or received by a public office in the conduct of its affairs. So basically when you're doing the work. Okay, so a public record is just this, any recorded information that was recorded as part of doing your job. So it's a really broad definition. Okay, so what I want to emphasize about that is it's nothing to do with formats. So let's look at how this kind of ties in with other legislation. Sorry, whoop, I think I put things in a slightly different order than I was expecting, but I'd like to talk about how this fits in. So PRA says, okay, you got to keep some stuff, but it's worth emphasizing people misunderstand public record, public meaning, oh, it's out in public, it's publicly available. Some classic examples of public records that would not be publicly available would be financial information, employee records, budget sensitive information before the government's budget's gone out, adoption records, you know, it just goes on and on. There are all kinds of things that are public records, and the obligations that we talk about under the PRA apply to them, but they're not actually things that are out in the open, okay? So public record does not mean publicly available. But then we've got this OIA that says you can ask for stuff, right? So what's this all about? Well, it turns out that's what the OIA is about. The OIA defines access to the things that you've got. So cool, I've got this document in front of me. Cool, I've got these records in this finance system. Cool, I've got this note sitting in my bottom drawer. The OIA says whether or not a member of the public or a company that is operating out of New Zealand can ask for information that we already have. People say this thing that as one of my little peeves. People say, oh, we've got to keep this because of the OIA. If you look at the legislation, the OIA does not talk about having, what information you must have. Funnily enough, it doesn't talk about creating a record because it's the Public Records Act that does that. So the Public Records Act and the OIA go hand in hand. If we haven't captured good information, then the likelihood that we can successfully respond to an OIA and provide people with the information that they're legally entitled to have is greatly reduced. Kind of wild, the OIA actually covers stuff that you've never recorded. So the OIA official information actually extends to things that are in people's heads. So you can legitimately say, hi, whatever ministry or department, I would like information about what you recollect about this topic. And I want to know what your chief executive remembers about this meeting. But in terms of that goal of transparency and accountability, if the stuff's not written down, if stuff's not recorded in some sense, and you can refer to those records, like what's the likelihood that, or what's yeah, I mean, how could you fairly say, oh, well, cool, like I trust that person who says, oh, well, my recollection was blah, is actually being honest? And how could you reasonably, if I was the one who was being asked for my recollections, like how do I answer that? How do I just fish these memories out of my head of like, well, my recollection's pretty, pretty shady on that one. I was thinking about what I was going to have for lunch. I don't remember, what I said at that meeting. So the PRA is the thing that says, well, make these records, keep these records so that information can be requested via the OIA. Okay. And then there's another piece of legislation that often comes up in this context. The third bit, as far as I'm concerned, you can think of like a kind of triumvirate of information-related legislation that affects government agencies. Privacy Act. The Privacy Act definitely extends way beyond government. And the Privacy Act, puts obligations on private companies and things as well. But it's true. I think a good juicy example would be to think of the entire justice sector. Think of the Department of Corrections holding, records of people who are in prison. Think of, the actual whole justice process, court processes, all of the records of the police as well. Um, a lot of this stuff will hold personal information about living people, and living people under the Privacy Act are entitled to privacy and certain obligations there. So where does this relate? One of the key places where it connects up is that people say, oh, but Privacy Act says basically I have to get rid of information when I don't need it if it's about a person and if it's subject to the Privacy Act in this way. And that's totally true. However, there is a legal obligation to make sure you don't destroy public records unless the chief archivist's like, yep, no worries, that's cool. So the power of the PRA in this regard is the PRA tells you when you can meet that principle in the Act. So really simply, in the Privacy Act, it's a set of principles versus in the PRA, there is a mandatory obligation to make sure you retain the information in public records that needs to be retained. So PRA wins when it comes to deciding whether or not you can destroy something. It's set in the Privacy Act. However, of course, the Privacy Act would give you a kind of an additional incentive to make sure that you are actively following through on disposal when you can, when you've got the legal authority. Yep. So I've said it can be personal information. I've said that, it can be of any format. So let's look at a crazy list of examples. Again, I'm not expecting you to digest all of this, but I've deliberately pulled out a range of different things. I'll just let this roll. So all of these could be a public record if they were received or created in the course of a public office, basically carrying out its affairs, people doing their work. If an email or an online chat was more like, hey, what are you having for lunch today? Funnily, I've got lunch on the brain, it seems. Yeah, that is explicitly listed in a particular document from the chief archivist. That's an example of what we can call a private record. It's not a public record. It's not subject to the Act. Okay. But what I wanted to call out is there's all kinds of stuff all over the place, sometimes internally, well, mostly internally facing, sometimes external, such as, if your organization puts posts on Facebook or another social media network, if you publish stuff on websites, if you send emails externally, if you do advertising campaigns or, put something on TV, all of those things are also public records. Yeah. So this might all sound super daunting. So the format is not the thing that matters, okay? It's not about what kind of envelope it comes in or what color the folder is that something's saved in, right? But we don't kind of think of all information as of equal value. And this ties back to the powers of the chief archivist to say, well, these are the things you need to keep for ages. These are the things you can get rid of whenever you feel like. So real life, managing information, managing records, I'm thinking this. I'm just thinking, you know what? Like your random note that you put on a whiteboard, I'm going to let you wipe that off and I'm not going to panic about it. That printout of something that's saved in a legitimate business system, and I'm going to manage that original in the system already, I don't care about your printout. Thanks, like get rid of it as soon as you can. And I'm going to focus my efforts on high value information, and in particular, high value and high risk information. Yeah. So we talk about this as appraisal. So I use the word appraising in there because that's the jargon that you'll hear in the profession. So we appraise the value of something. It's the same thing like an insurance company appraises the value of your house. It's going, well, how important is this from the perspective of how long we want to keep it? Okay, so you definitely do not need to manage all of those examples that I put on the previous slide to the same level of effort or the same level of kind of quality, if you like. Alrighty. So then how do I know if I'm managing that high value bit well? And going back to those 3 points, so are we creating the right things? Are we looking after them? Like, are we maintaining them over time so that are accessible while we need to keep them? And when and how can we dispose of them, right? So these are the 3 questions that might be on our mind when we're thinking about, are we doing this well? So this is back to that 3 themes: create records, maintain the records, dispose of records. Yeah. And how? How are you going to figure this out? Well, funnily enough, Archives New Zealand is the regulator. They're the ones who administer the Public Records Act. Here's a page that says your responsibilities. So that would be a great start. So being slightly facetious, but I would recommend that you go and take a look at Archives New Zealand's website. And what I'd be thinking about, so I mentioned right at the start, there is mandatory standard. So one of the powers of the chief archivist is to issue standards and to say who they must apply to and whether or not they're mandatory or whether they're just sort of best practice. So there's one standard which makes it super easy, and you must comply with that if you're a public office. So if you and maybe I should mention that actually on Archives New Zealand website there is a page where you can go and do a search and go, is my organisation actually a public office? And it's there in black and white whether or not the Public Records Act applies to your organisation. And as well as the standard, so if the standard says what is it that you must do? Then there is also what's called the implementation guide, and the implementation guide goes through each of the requirements of the standard and says, here's what they might look like. Here's what the work might be that you need to do in order to make sure that you're meeting those minimum requirements that are in the standard. Okay. Oh, and there's where you go. So write that one down if you are not on our mailing list. So then, as well as that, like obviously you can go and dig into the standard and you can have a look at those 21 minimum requirements and you can just, think about, well, do I reckon this is happening at my organization? Is this how we work? And that is obviously one way that you can assess whether or not your organization is compliant with the Public Records Act. A second thing, again on Archives New Zealand's website, there is this thing. So the Information Management Maturity Assessment. And I think any organization could benefit from having a crack at that. I'll repeat myself from right near the start just to emphasize that there's information management, there's records management, there's a lot of conversation around those words. Sometimes I think information management is just a bit of a rebrand, and I see people who call themselves information managers, and really I think they're doing records management. This distinction, like basically for the purposes of thinking about compliance, just substitute those things however you like in your head. Information management maturity assessment, records management maturity assessment, like whatever. So I just wanted to emphasize that sometimes I might say information, sometimes I might say records. Really, I think for the purposes of this session today, they're as good as the same thing. And you always have a third option, which is that Archives New Zealand, one of the both powers and sort of obligations on Archives New Zealand established in the Public Records Act is go out there and audit people. Find out whether or not people are actually doing those things that align with the purposes of the Act. Are they creating the right things? Are they managing those things? Do they maintain the records of what what they are doing and how they conduct their affairs? And are they regularly disposing of information? Yeah. So brace. I'm going to do a speed run of all 21 compliance requirements, and that's going to be the end of the bit that I'm presenting today. Very happy to take questions after, but I'm going to go through 21 different things, and I'm going to have to go fast, and it's going to be too much, but I just want to put it out there again for the purposes of just sort of giving you a flavor of what compliance really looks like in real life and what it means to create, maintain, and dispose of records. So the mandatory standard has 3 principles, and then it has requirements that sit under each principle. This first one is basically saying, as a first principle, your public office that you work for is responsible for managing information and records. Yeah. And the kinds of requirements that show up there. So your executive should have signed off or must sign off a strategy that describes how you manage information in your organization or how you manage public records. And then to sort of enact that, then you must have a policy. Again, the standard actually specifies it needs to be your exec who signs off a policy that says, so this is what we do. Like, this is our strategy. It sets the direction for where we're going. So on the day-to-day, this is the policy we have that says, the way that we work at the highest level in our organization to ensure we meet these outcomes. Then, funnily enough, you have to pay attention to that, not just pop it in the drawer. So that's the point of that. And somewhat controversially, for some organizations, your leadership team is responsible for setting the direction for information management at your organization, for setting the scene, for saying this is what is acceptable at our organization to ensure that we meet our minimum compliance obligations. This stuff may be a challenge, especially if you're just one person who's just moved into a sort of a records related role. But one of the things in the Act, or sorry, in the standard, is the Chief Archivist has specified that an organisation must nominate an executive sponsor who is like your official liaison up at the exec level with Archives New Zealand. So maybe it's someone who's Chief Operations Officer or Chief Information Officer, or I don't know, it could be Head of Finance or Risk or whoever. Normally, or not normally, preferably someone on your leadership team at your organization who is responsible for basically showing up, having those conversations with Archives New Zealand around how you're going as an organization and how your compliance looks, what support you need, and so on. I don't know why I laugh, but I laugh. Yeah, there is an obligation that the organisation should actually invest in this work. So it specifies within the standard that this could either be in-sourced, as in you're paying for someone to be an information management professional inside your organisation, or you're outsourcing that to someone, getting in skills that you need through an outsourcing arrangement. In this obligation is essentially saying that actually the responsibility sits with managers of a particular line of business. So say in the finance context, it is whoever is kind of the chief financial officer, it is their responsibility to integrate good information management into how the finance team works or how financial management activities operate within an organization. So it's basically sort of pushing obligations down one level and saying the accountabilities around managing records well ought to or must sit with the line of business. Then something that I haven't even touched on in the Act, but is really important, is public office can't just dodge its responsibilities by outsourcing. So public office can't say, "Oh, lol, I asked this IT vendor to do this work, and so they haven't created any records. I'm sure that's fine." That's not how it works. I can't go, "Oh, cool, I'm going to outsource this policy writing to someone else and don't need to collect any records of that." So an example of that would be, for me in my work life, relatively recently, worked with a company around submissions analysis. So, an organization I worked for put out public submissions process, advertised a web address where you could go and you could submit about a public process. And then we outsourced the people who did the data crunching afterwards and said, oh, what did you learn from these, thousands of submissions? And as part of that, I worked with our contract people to make sure there was kind of a clear indication of what the process looked like, what records that organisation would provide back to us when we're finished with that contract, to make sure that we're meeting our obligations and meeting the purposes of the Act. So we could still be held to account for what we did, even though we subcontracted the work. Yep. And yeah, there's an interesting point here, but it just says that you must make sure that whatever you're doing actually lines up with what you exist for. Like, why is my organization here? Like, what are we trying to do? And so basically, yeah, I've framed this here, make sure this meets business needs. So you've got a policy, great. Does your policy stuff up your business? It shouldn't, and it mustn't. And so that's what that requirement is saying. So I'll just jump back there, you can digest that. So just to recap, really this is all about sort of setting the scene and saying, look, within my organization, we need a direction, we need really broad high level views, and we need accountabilities at the management level to basically say, hey, this is how we manage information and records in our public office. Okay. So then there's a whole thing that segues through from number 9 there, make sure this meets business needs. It says you've got to make sure that your information and records management actually supports what you're here to do. So like if you're Treasury, why does Treasury exist? Like what are those processes that Treasury must carry out to kind of fulfill its functions, right? And so the requirements here start to get into that thing of understanding what it is you actually do as an organization, and then understanding, okay, well, these are the bits where like these records are the ones that really matter. Imagine you're I was going to use the example of land title records, and I can't think what office actually holds those, but imagine you went, oh no, just kidding, I'll just chuck out the records of people's land ownership in New Zealand. Like that would be a problem, right? And to that point that you can't manage everything equally, no one's got the resources to do that, and it doesn't make any sense from a public investment kind of perspective. You've got to be able to identify high value records. Maybe a better example would be that if if it was inland revenue and suddenly they just accidentally lost the records of every taxpayer's either debts or amounts owing, like that would be an absolute disaster for New Zealand and would have an immediate impact on New Zealand as a whole. So these are high value records. And then high risk and high value lines of business must be identified. So this is this idea that you basically need to identify what your organization does. And I think some information management work crosses over with business analysis. If you ever work with a BA, a business analyst, in understanding what are these processes that create high value records and what are these processes that need high value records. So it's either like as an input to the process or it's an output of the process. And if you can't identify these things, then you don't really know where to put your effort in terms of investing in information and records. And then once you've figured the above out, make sure that any kind of a system, and normally a system involves technology. So normally a system is an IT system, but really it's a system meaning the processes, the policies, the procedures, and the tools that you use to complete the work, the resources, the monitoring, governance. Like make sure where you're establishing how you work, and especially with technology, make sure that it's all set up to basically manage high value information to the right standard. So basically make sure you can easily create those records. And I think that's actually the next requirement. Maintain them over time for as long as you need them, and also get rid of them at the end in a defensible way. The standard bothers to emphasize that you need to think about the phrase it uses from memory as operating environments and contexts. So you need to cover off all the ways people might work, and you need to make sure all of those ways could meet your requirements goals. Your compliance goals. There will be some systems that are going to hold really long-term information, and typically this is the information where, and I haven't explicitly made this link, at the point of disposal, I'm not throwing it out, I'm sending it to Archives New Zealand, so what we call transfer to Archives New Zealand. So there'll be certain systems where I want to maintain records, which might be for up to 25 years, and then I need to get stuff out of that system and I need to transfer it to Archives New Zealand. So make sure you've identified what systems hold that kind of information and you know how you would do that, is basically the guts of this one. Because funnily enough, when we put in IT systems, we typically don't ever talk about the endpoint and we don't design for the exit. Because funnily enough, vendors aren't really incentivized to do that. Like if I'm putting in a system and I'm like, sweet, I'm going to make money off your organization every year, collect a sweet check, provide fine support services on an annual basis in exchange for some dollars. There's no real incentive for me to say, oh, and it's really easy to stop using us and to stop giving us money, but there is an obligation on us in our public offices to make sure that we could do that if we needed to. Yeah. And that flows through into this next point, which is that we ought to, well, not ought to, I keep saying ought to or should, but we must, like all of these are minimum requirements. We make sure that information management is baked into, these requirements are considerations and inputs into how we do any kind of change. A system migration is a really obvious one, like, I think we're going to turn off this old system now. We'll just let all the records go, shall we? We'll just randomly delete everything. Like that would be an absolutely illegal activity to just sort of let all this information go, unless you've done all the right work to appraise the value of the records and gone, yep, cool, this can be disposed of, provided we follow a particular process. But it's also about restructures. It's also about what we call a functional transfer, which is where, what's an example in recent times? So a pretty obvious example in recent times is there was the Ministry for Disabled People, Whaikaha, and they were managing disability support payments. So, you're providing support to someone in your house and you can receive some money for doing that. And the government said, actually, we think that would better sit with the Ministry of Social Development. And so a function of one ministry gets picked up and moved and dropped. And what this requirement 2.6 is saying is you ought to have thought about that at the start. You ought to be able to bake that into your systems so that you're ready for those kinds of scenarios. Okay. The final one is the one that kind of gets down to the stuff that information managers and records managers might be thinking about more on the day-to-day, really. And this is often where a bunch of the investment goes in terms of sort of operational work. So information and records are well managed. Yep. So first up, you must look at your systems, look at your processes, and make sure it's really easy for people to create good records as part of that. To get into the detail a little, that could be that it's really easy for me to click a button and capture the right information, and perhaps there's structured data that tells me, oh, you must capture this and this and this, these three things about the work that I'm doing, so that the records are complete. So it makes it easy for me to remember what information I do need to record, and perhaps I'm capturing information that actually might trigger a workflow or might be something I can look at later that says, oh, is this information still current? Is this information we could dispose of? Yeah, so make it easy to do that create step. And then I mentioned that idea of capturing information about things. The standard talks about metadata. So metadata is information that describes something, such as Classic ones are things like a title, a last modified date, the person who last modified something. These are metadata that describe a record, and this requirement says you must have good metadata that um, gives you that trust that the thing you're looking at is the thing it purports to be, basically. So is this the right thing? One way of thinking about metadata that I've always really liked is the idea that you have a tin, like a can, and you want to know without having to open it whether it's cat food or whether it's for humans. And metadata would be the label on that tin that tells you about that thing before you open it. Similarly, with looking at objects, if you think about this in your day-to-day, perhaps you're accessing an email, a piece of metadata on the email, like who it's from, might tell you whether or not that's the right one that you were looking for. And then the second part of that requirement is saying you need to audit. You need to audit stuff. So you basically need to make sure that the metadata has been captured that would make this reliable, would make the system work, would make sure that you are creating and maintaining the right records. And this one really flows through, which is basically I forget the exact wording, but it pretty much straight up says test whether you can actually find stuff and whether you can trust that you have found it. So going back to that point under principle 2 around making sure you've identified high value and information, high risk processes, you might go, right, I know we must be reliably able to capture, must be able to reliably find records of, I don't know, public consultation on a piece of government policy. I'm going to try that. I'm going to try and find that in my system. I'm going to try and see whether I can get, the records that I need back out of the system. And again, when I'm saying system, partly it's about the tools and technology, but it's also partly about processes and things like, is it sitting with the right people? Have they kind of put it somewhere where it's protected from, just being randomly thrown away? And that flows through. So number 4 is really that maintain idea. So especially lost is, and especially in the context of paper and things, you don't want, I don't know, random stuff sitting in the back office somewhere on paper. You don't want to run the risk that that can just be gotten rid of. The Act never talks about messing with, never uses that phrase, but yeah, don't let people mess with stuff. Don't let people overwrite things. Don't let people go, oh, lol, I was never there. I'm just going to take myself out of this meeting. Thanks. And typically in IT systems where we're talking about documents, that relates to version control. Line of business systems like HR systems and finance systems are often they're really strong on this point. They really bake in the idea that you can't overwrite a record, but you add to it. Like you can put a second comment or a revision, or you're sort of expanding on the history of what's there, but you can't overwrite. Yeah. And make sure that access is considered as part of all of this. So I haven't touched on that, but access is actually talked about in the Act, in the Public Records Act itself. But also, if you think about the purposes in terms of that accountability of government, in terms of giving the public trust that we're managing information well and so forth, we want to make sure that we're baking in good access controls around who can access what, who needs to access what, who might benefit from accessing stuff, and the risk is okay. Like what are those rules and how are they managed in a sustainable way because they're built into the design of your processes and systems. Yeah. And then number 6 is really just calling out this thing around the chief archivist establishing grants the authority to dispose of records. Might say, okay, this set of records. What's a classic example? Okay, so a classic one is chief archivist has authorized the disposal of employee files that don't meet certain other criteria, but in general, employee files 10 years after cessation of employment. So you actually then need to make some decisions about what you're looking at. You need to say, okay, cool, these are ones that we can keep, these are ones that we will actively destroy, or these are ones that we are going to transfer to Archives New Zealand. An interesting one that applies to all public offices is the master record of external communications by your organisation must be transferred to Archives New Zealand. So that's one where I've found in my work there's a bunch of interpretation. So there's work to be done to ensure compliance, and that's exactly the kind of situation where I think about the spirit of the Act. It's like, well, what does that mean? What's an external communication that kind of matters in the sense of the Act? And this last one, I'm using the casual phrase of they get rid of. You need to demonstrate routine disposal, right? So you need to demonstrate that, you can routinely get rid of what you can when it makes sense to do so. So one thing that I decided not to go into detail about in here, and I haven't even written it in the slides, is there is this whole process of seeking that authority to dispose of information from the Chief Archivist. And so there's a whole set of disposal authorities that already exist. There are the general disposal authorities that cover all public offices, and they say, hey, for these kinds of activities, these kinds of records that basically you're going to see across every organisation or most organisations, this is how long you need to retain stuff for. This is what you need to transfer to archives. This is what you can destroy. And then there are agency specific ones. So in your organisation, one of your compliance points might be, do we have a disposal authority that covers our records? We can't do many of these things. We can't routinely get rid of the information that we hold if we have not been granted the authority to do so by the Chief Archivist. Yeah. Okay, we've only got 8 minutes, so that's my zoom through. And as I say, it's just to kind of give you a flavour of what's there, and I'd strongly encourage you to go and check out the standard on archives.gov.nz. If I wind it all the way back around, we go all the way back to those three things, right? You've got to create records. You've got to demonstrate that you are capturing records of what your organisation does to meet those purposes of the Act, such as being able to demonstrate to the public of New Zealand that basically you're doing the right thing and maintain those records over time. So don't just go, cool, we made a record, but also I chucked it out next Tuesday. You have to demonstrate that you're keeping those records for as long as they're required, and so long as there's an expectation that they be kept, and for more than the minimum retention period that has been authorised by the Chief Archivist. And lucky last, dispose. So if I've got those high value records that I know need to be transferred to Archives New Zealand, then it's on me to get those things and transfer those things to Archives New Zealand. If I've got low value stuff, I've got absolute dross, sitting cluttering up my systems and things, then it's on me in terms of an information management obligation to make sure that my public office is disposing of those things. Cool. All right, went a bit longer than I meant to, but we do have a few minutes for any questions, if anyone has any. So I might just stop sharing and I'll have a nosy. Do we have anything in the chat? You're welcome to pop some things in there.
Kia ora, Michael. Anna Blackman here.
Kia ora.
Just while we're waiting for any other questions, I just wondered whether maybe ARNZ could consider having one of these on the Privacy Act as it applies to archives and collecting archives.
Ah, super interesting. Nice one.
And I should say thank you for your presentation. That was great.
You're very welcome. Yeah. You're very welcome.
Yeah.
Yep. Does anyone else have questions?
I've got one, Michael. Just a question. Is the broad data that's collected, so your systems of record has got data, that At basic level, is that considered a record irrespective of its value? When you, for example, when you're creating a disposal authority, do you classify that as a separate class, or does it? I always wondered that sort of thing.
Oh, right. Yeah. So it gets mucky. I'll be blunt, but so if you think of data as just being a format, like if back in the day I'd received something and it was a written table or it's a summary of stuff that's all on paper, like paper form responses, at some point I combine those things and they become data and I might put them in a system. But nothing's changed about the informational value of that. So I guess it's just an example where it's not about the format, it's about the value, and determining where it fits in the disposal authority is about looking at the purpose for which you collected it. So why I say it gets mucky is because data is often really reusable and really, it's like, cool, I'm going to use this in my finance context, I'm going to use that in the policy context, I'm going to use it in multiple contexts, in which case the normal rule of thumb is that the longest retention rule wins. So if something says you ought to keep this for 25 years, then you keep it for 25 years.
Makes sense. It still needs to be included somewhere. There's just that muckiness around how long you retain it for potentially, or what you do with it.
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome.
And something I didn't touch on at all is that there are times when if I receive that data from another public office, we might agree that that public office, it's their master record and it's their responsibility to look after it. That's the thing with increased information sharing across central government, at least, that's one of the things that I see gets complicated. People are like, so do we keep our own copy of everything we receive from, some other agency? Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. There's a question in the chat about whether, if I have a feeling for whether in general senior leaders are becoming more or less receptive to funding IM in their organisation. I'll be honest, one of the reasons I've talked about the spirit of the Act or the purposes is because I find that can be more compelling for people, or looking at particular requirements. Sorry, this is a slight dodge. I don't really have a strong feeling one way or the other about whether people are kind of getting more interested, but I don't have many successful arguments with people at a senior level around the topic of compliance, like just we must. It's true, people aren't going to write down, in terms of this context of creating records, people aren't going to put in writing, we're happy to not comply. But I guess what I'm thinking is that you can get more traction if you can connect something to the business outcomes, and in the standard where it's talking about how you basically need to make sure that you're collecting sufficient information and records to serve the business. I think that's normally what's compelling for people. It's like, hey, this is going to reduce costs, it's going to reduce risk, it's going to increase money in for those organizations that collect money. It's going to increase staff efficiency, which is another version of reduced costs. Or the last one is reputational risk. So there was a case with the chief archivist looking into compliance of MB recently, Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment. And is that even true? Anyway, whatever MB stands for. And that's an example where, like, it would have cost them because they would have had staff who would have needed to respond to the chief archivist's requests. And it also had that reputational risk that basically they're getting dragged in the news. So those are the kinds of things I find compelling for senior leaders more than legislative compliance, if I'm just going to be super honest. No reason not to. Probably have time for one more, if there's one more lurking out there. No, cool. All right. So thank you one and all. Thanks for attending, and hope you have a great afternoon. And for those of you who are members of ARANS or RIMPA, you can get access to the recording after the session, so check that out. And thanks for all your lovely reactions. That's awesome. Nice one.